Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Para hacer la sesión más fácil para la profesora Rosenwein, mantendremos toda la conversación en inglés. Creo que ya les han advertido que podían ustedes servirse de los cascos. So one of the things that really I was very much interested when I began to envision how the Festival of Ideas was going to be is that I didn't want it to be a festival simply of philosophers or these people that usually have the label of thinkers. I was very much also in the idea of bringing some other people related to the humanities, including the humanities and the arts. And then we have some people coming from theater, people coming from the visual arts, from photography, for example, or from some other disciplinary fields. But I was very much interested also in bringing people from history, because I think history is one of those fields that have many things to say. And I'm very pleased that one of the historians that today represent this trend of thought is Barbara Rosenwein, who is here with us today. So very likely you know already who she is. I mean, Barbara, she was trained as a medievalist, and then she's been a medievalist for much of her professional career. I mean, she will tell me if I'm wrong. And then eventually she became interested in these communities of middle-aged monks and scholars, and came up with this idea of emotional communities, one of her most famous books, and perhaps the one that actually opened up the field in many different ways, was Emotional Communities in the Early Modern, in the early Middle Ages, I think it is, right? And after that book, I mean, which is a very famous book precisely because, as far as I know, it is the first time that the expression, the very catchy expression, emotional communities, was used. After that book, she wrote another one, which is one of my favorites, which is Generations of Feelings. And this is a fascinating book about how emotions and expressions are tied together from classical times to the present. Later on, she's become interested in many other fields, including within the history of the emotions. I mean, as far as I can tell, she's one of the leading figures in a growing field of this history of the emotions and the international reflection and intellectual reflection on emotions. But then she also became interested in specific fields, in specific emotions within that field, including rage, of which she wrote a wonderful book, and love. That one has been translated into Spanish, I think, a couple of years ago. El amor en 5 fantasías, I think it is the Spanish translation. And most recently, she just finished a book on emotions in the elderly, in the old age, which I think it is quite an achievement. I mean, considering that usually when historians of emotions deal with emotions, they do not make any sort of difference regarding the age of those who feel or who are involved in those particular emotions. So the conversation today is going to be very much about love. I mean, this will be the second part of our conversation, but I would like to ask you, I mean, to begin this conversation, this interview, this whatever you want to call it, by asking you more general questions that perhaps involve this kind of demand that I made at the very beginning regarding the use of history and the presence of history in intellectual debates. So two questions to begin with, Barbara. First of all, why history should matter to us, in which way, and why you think it is important. I mean, in a certain way, I mean, the question is rather, what is history and who cares about history? And we should be cared about what happened so many years ago, so many centuries ago, why medieval history is important to us in many ways. And I was, that would be the first very general question.
Yes, and such a good question. Thank you. It's a marvelous question. But before I answer it, I just want to say how happy I am to be here. Encantada. and to be with Javier Moscoso, who is not just a philosopher, but a cultural anthropologist who has worked on such important and unthinkable topics such as swinging. Who would ever think to write a book on the swing? But it's a fantastic book, so I'm so happy to be here. Now, when you ask me why history, why study medieval history, it's a fantastic question to ask of an American, because most people in the United States would say there is no reason. It's a useless topic, and it should be banned or at least minimized at the universities. And my answer, and so many other historians' answer, is the obvious one. We need to know about who we are. And who we are is not just shaped by the present. It's shaped by all sorts of traditions and all sorts of events that still are important for understanding who we are. It can be, history has been misused. It has been misused by political factions with their own agendas. All good things can be misused. But if it is taken aright, history is like a bottomless treasury of knowledge about who we are. And if we dip into that treasury, we don't actually deplete it. We just learn from it. It may be that for example, in the United States, where so many of us are very worried about the spread of misinformation that in many ways has historical ancillaries and roots. If you tell someone who believes in what I would call misinformation, that's misinformation, and it's an old story that was always used to turn different kinds of people into bad people, other people, people to exclude. Even if I said that to you, and you wanted to believe in this misinformation, at least my being able to cite the historical tradition, the historical roots, the historical horrors that were already involved in such stories might give you pause, might make you think. And that's what history can do. It can make us think about who we are and about what we have done, good and bad and indifferent, and therefore what we can do. So I think history is an overlooked, vital resource for us that has been given short shrift recently because the sciences have taken over. I have nothing against the sciences, but even the sciences need to know, and many scientists do know, that they don't come out of nothing, but rather have in fact developed over time, and that they stand on the shoulders of giants.
Thank you. Thank you. We will come back later on to these uses of the past into the present. As a medievalist, I mean, very very likely. I mean, while I was also listening to you, I was thinking of also because of this childish phrase with which you end up the last question. I was thinking of this sort of a cliche about the medieval ages, but very likely you had to face in your young years of academia, portraying the Middle Ages as a period of irrational human beings, so a period very much marked by passionate and childish human beings. I mean, I'm thinking of Huizinga and the dawn of the Middle Ages. I'm thinking of Norbert Elias, the process of civilization. Could you tell us a little bit to which extent you think this is true? I mean, the very idea, for example, that people in the Middle Ages, that parents didn't love their children, which is a fascinating idea that was very popular for many years. Yeah. Could you please tell us something? I mean, did that have any impact in the way you developed an interest in the history of emotions?
Well, very much so, because I knew better. The fact is that in the Middle Ages, there were children, of course, and children are children, but there were also adults, and they had values, they had ethics, they had controls over what emotions they thought expressive of real feelings. They knew very much about fake feelings. They knew a great deal about which feelings they privileged, which emotions they pushed away, how to mold emotions. I think not only of my monks, which I worked on for many years, but also warriors and the growing burgher class. All of these groups developed emotional norms that were, for them, very moral, ethical, important, and by no means impulsive. And they would have been perplexed by the notion that they were childish. One of the reasons that Elias comes up with this idea of the childishness of the Middle Ages is because he takes seriously the critiques that medieval people themselves made of certain behaviors that they considered to be unacceptable, like urinating on the floor, for example, if I may use an image. He thought that's what medieval people did, but in fact, the evidence that he shows is that these were satires of exaggerations, criticisms of, in some cases, fantasies that never were or were rarely carried out, so that in a way he was taking fake news and elevating it to, this is what people were like, this is what they believed.
Yeah, but let me push you a little bit on that. I mean, if we, I think we all sympathize that perhaps the idea that these people had of the Middle Ages was a little bit fancy, as it were. Yeah. But then, I mean, if we look, for example, at the history of cruelty, at the history of physical punishment, at the history of education, of manners, yeah. Wouldn't you say that we could still see a certain evolution, even in progressive terms? Is that entirely wrong?
Yes, it's entirely wrong, because what you really do see is waves of cruelty. You can see a tremendous amount of cruelty in what we would call the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, the period of witch hunts and the period of inquisitions, the period also, and the 100 Years' War. That was a period of great violence. But then to bring that back and say it was the same in the 12th century isn't correct. It's just not it wasn't the same. 12th century, you do see roots of what's going to happen later on. You do see the beginnings of prejudice against sodomy, of the burning. Well, no, the burning of the Hebrew Torah was really in the 13th century. No, you do see in the 12th century elites starting to vilify certain groups, and those groups will later become the objects of very serious violence. Then there's a reaction against that after the 1648 and the religious wars. And so you see really the beginning of the Enlightenment, and not the Enlightenment that it is entirely enlightened, but that there are arguments against violence and so on. And then you have Voltaire, for example. But also, at the end of that enlightened period, you have the French Revolution. And you can say a lot of wonderful things about the French Revolution, but also a lot of things about the violence. Steven Pinker has written a book about the evolution of violence, and it's always evolved toward the better. We are less violent today than we were in the past. But it has been well refuted in a book. Pinker's book is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and in a book called The Lesser Angels of Our Nature, much of what Pinker has said has been debunked. The statistics, the tables, it's so impressive, but it is really problematic. So, yes.
Well, thank you for your reply and your answer. Certainly, I mean, one of the things that has changed your life is that you found this idea. I mean, it is this reality of the emotional communities. The phrase has been with us since many years ago, and I mean very likely, I mean, in the audience there will be people who have a different understanding of what an emotional community is and how you reach that. First of all, how you reached how you arrived to that discovery, and then to which extent it has changed your view over the last, say, 10, 12 years.
Oh, thank you. So I knew that I had to write something really critiquing the idea that medieval people were childish, impulsive, violent, and but my question always to myself was, how do I do that exactly? But I've already sort of given you the answer, because I had been working on monks for years and years and years, and I knew a lot about the rules and regulations by which monks lived and why they were admired, what the society around them considered to be so virtuous. And so that was like, in my mind, that was a group, but I couldn't generalize monks to the whole of medieval society, of course, because numerous people were not monks. And so I began to think about, well, maybe I can find the emotional and ethical rules by which different groups within this society governed themselves, felt comfortable with. And it was that slow realization that I could not deal with all of medieval society and generalize about it that made me, gave me the ability to focus on groups, social groups that agreed more or less, not entirely of course, on the feelings that they privileged, the feelings that they held at bay, the feelings that they didn't even think about, just made no impact on them. Now, that's changed because I realized that's very much a medievalist's notion of society. You know, medieval people themselves talked about the three orders of society: those who work on the bottom, those who pray, and then those who fight. So they thought of themselves in terms of different communities with different tasks, social tasks that all work together to perform, to produce a coherent and functioning society and culture. If you think about the modern world, at this point, I have to ask you, what do we have a uniform culture? Looks to me like we're starting to split up into factions that don't even speak to one another. And we're going to be talking about various emotional communities within, well, I'll just use the US example, that are really kept quite separate because they live in different communities. They buy different clothes. They differentiate themselves by political party, by beliefs, and I don't know where we're coming. I mean, because we don't even have a society with a sense that although there are different groups, they all work together for some kind of a coherent culture. What do you think?
Well, I think I'd rather keep the role of the interviewer. Let me, no, because I don't want to. I mean, thank you for trying to involve me in the conversation on that regard. But I just want to keep interviewing you. Let me go back to the emotional communities. I mean, perhaps we will find a way out and try to clarify some of the issues here. I mean, first of all, the very notion of emotional community. I mean, I think everyone would understand that you say, well, people who share feelings and emotions and so on, and this is, well, that seems to be pretty clear. But then at the end of the day, it is not really that clear, because we don't know whether we are talking about, say, expressions of emotions to begin with. I mean, say, for example, the way in which people would be allowed to cry or to shout in different contexts, the way in which people should declare their love, or that is one thing that is expressions are concerned, or whether we are talking, I mean, not about the possibility of expression of prohibited emotions, but rather how we feel, not simply how we express feelings, but how we feel. So that would be my first, question to clarify what an emotional community is. Are we talking about expressions? Are we talking about feelings?
Well, my radical answer is that we are talking about real feelings. And the only way we know about real feelings is when they are expressed to ourselves. We can not say it to someone else, but the feeling is inchoate, is indefinable, unless you do have some kind of vocabulary. It can be a vocabulary of words, it can be a vocabulary of bodily movements, as in dance, or in drama. It can be a vocabulary of emojis, which you don't even express, you just point to and they click and they express something. But the only way in which a kind of baseline of bzz, 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 feeling then welling up as something that we will call an emotion, the only way we can get at it is to point to it, to move it, to say it. Scientists would say to look at the oxygenation in the brain, but it has to be expressed somehow, or what is it really? You cannot put an emotion under a microscope or look at it through a telescope, and if you think that oxygenation of the brain is actually telling you what emotion you're looking at, I think you're quite far from the reality. I'm afraid that our only access is via expression of some sort. Or we say, I'm feeling something, but what is it? But at some point.
So my second question about emotional communities has to do a little bit with this reflection that you made before about the Middle Ages. In that case, you thought that the emotional communities should be allowed for someone to belong to different communities, to belong to different emotional communities, irrespectively, if I understood you correctly, irrespectively also of the statement of the social status of that particular person. But my question is about transhistorical emotional communities, which is something very much, not simply in terms of your last books, which are transhistorical. I mean, you don't focus on the Middle Ages anymore. No. You cover not only different cultural settings, but also longue durée history of the emotions, and of course that creates difficulties in terms of the dynamics of the emotional communities. Mm-hmm. But my question in this particular case, I'm rather thinking of emotional communities nowadays, of those who belong to an emotional community because they say the community of the First Nations, for example, the community of those who, for some reason, have a sense of belonging to a community of people, the majority of which are already dead. Yeah. Is that an option? Is that an emotional community?
That's so interesting because it is really a wonderful question because although the concept of belonging to an emotional community can easily fragment. For example, I can say, I identify with Native Americans, well, in general. But I don't think that makes for an emotional community. Okay. It makes for something that is a bit more superficial, I would say, a way to identify yourself or make a statement about yourself politically and sentimentally, but it doesn't mean that when I'm with a group, let's say I am, I shouldn't even be doing this, Iroquois, and I'm with a group that's Shawnee, I don't know that we would be laughing at the same thing, crying at the same thing. having the same responses to different events, because these are not really. The one is one kind of social community, the other is another kind of social community. So there's a large society, and within that are emotional communities. And within those emotional communities are sub-emotional communities that are even closer and tighter and more secure. And then these sometimes intersect in certain segments with groups outside of them, and yet don't intersect with other groups. In a way, if I may say so, emotional communities is a way to think about emotions and groups of people who express emotions, and whether those emotions are similar or different. But I would not want to reify emotional communities. I don't think you can point to an emotional community, though you could sometimes say, if you're laughing with a group of friends, goodness, we're all the same. We're an emotional community here. Or we're crying together about the same things. You might say that. But again, I think it's a heuristic device to allow us to think about emotions in history, and then how they both remain the same and change over time so that they can be trans-historical. And that's why it's so important to know our history, because our history, coming back to your first question, really, our history is always has roots.
What do you think? I mean, going back to and I have to leave some minutes for talking about love and the end of love and heartbreak and all that, yeah, because otherwise people will be a little bit upset. But so to perhaps the same question in a different way, so that we could trace the love and get into the love thing. Why you think history of the emotions has become so popular today, and why you pick up, I mean, for your last books, one was about anger and the other one was about love. I mean, that was a matter of chance. I mean, you were one day walking around and said, well, what is it that I'm going to do? Or there wasn't a specific reason for choosing those ones?
Yes, so my specific reason actually for both of them was that there's such interesting ambivalent feelings, because love is both a virtue, as we all think of it, most of us think of it, but then again, human love between humans was often, especially in the Middle Ages, considered to be just lust, and therefore a vice. And so I was interested in the ambivalence that this feeling, which has had a certain continuity of word, amor in Latin, amor in Spanish, even today, amore in Italian, in the Romance languages. You can just see a lineage, but my goodness, its evaluation has changed depending on different groups and at different times. Similarly, anger, ira, is one of the 7 sins, principal sins, and yet, on the other hand, the anger on behalf of God, the anger of God is virtuous. And so anger, too, is an ambivalent emotion. it can be both a virtue and a vice. And if I were to go on, I would say sorrow is another one that could be treated in that manner. But I decided I don't want to go through all the 7 principal sins or virtues.
Let's talk about. I mean, I would love to talk to you about anger and many things could come up about that conversation. But then let's focus on love.
Sure.
Because love is nowadays very much called into question on different fronts. It seems that there are. Cupido, as it were, has plenty of enemies nowadays. And first of all, I mean, why you think it is that? And then your book is called Love, I think it's Story in 5 Fantasies or something like that. History in 5 Fantasies.
Yes.
Is love a fantasy? Is really a crystallization, as Stendhal used to say, a sort of a false consciousness? Those people who are in love do really live in a sort of magical alienation, as it were?
No, love is not a fantasy, but it is complicated. It has so many meanings for us, and it can be used so beautifully and so exploitatively, and it is so painful and so pleasurable that my idea is that we have a way of taming it so that it isn't so overwhelming for us by certain sets of expectations of what it's going to be like, both for us and for those whom we love, so that the one we love will be obsessed with me and I with him, or he will have the exact same thoughts I have and I with his, or he will fly from love of me to love of God as quickly as he can possibly go. And so these expectations become ways of our managing a feeling that is so complicated that most psychologists don't include love in their list of emotions because, well...
There is this wonderful novel by Julian Barnes. I think it is called The Only Story or something like that, and I don't quite remember the title. And Julian Barnes, in the introduction, says love is so interesting because everyone has a story about that. Yeah. So it is the sort of a human experience about which we all have a story to tell. In a sense, we all historians of our own experience. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that is, I'm very much sympathetic to that point of view because, you are forced to take history seriously at least once in your life to tell your love story or love stories or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. But that also creates some difficulties for the professionals, as it were, including yourself, because you're talking about something of which anyone everywhere has a saying. Are you not afraid?
Oh, I always tread where angels fear to tread, always. Yes, of course I'm afraid. And I never would mean that this is the history of love, and these are the only 5 fantasies, and that there never was another one, and there never will be. By no means. It's just that as I worked through tremendous amount of literature and letters and diaries and theoretical works on love, I thought I see certain themes that continue. As a matter of fact, before I wrote the book, I thought maybe I'm going to be really writing about memes I don't know what that is in Spanish, but these constant survivors of that go viral. It turned out I wasn't talking about memes, because memes don't really change. They're fixed, or I think so. I'm not an expert on memes, but these fantasies of love with certain thematic similarities did change over time. And you asked about why love is rather criticized nowadays as a feeling. I don't think that that's absolutely new. Actually, think about poor Abelard. He criticized his own love as pure lust because he bought the church view. So too, there is no question that love has the potential to hurt, to hurt terribly, to exploit, to dominate someone who does not even want to be dominated, to gaslight, all sorts of terrible things. But I don't know that that really means that in our time, love is downgraded. Its dangers are recognized. But what is the significance of going into the grocery store and holding up a pineapple upside down if there isn't some hope?
Yeah, that's a very good point. One way, I mean, one possible question, in my case, I mean, whenever we have to do these longue durée histories of emotions, I mean, we always have the same problem, which is, first of all, we try not to get into this biological reductionism, saying, well, emotions don't change over time, because if that were the case, we couldn't do what we do. That's for sure. But then at the same time, I mean, there should be some sort of substrate. I mean, something as you just mentioned. I mean, there must be something in common. I mean, something that must be called love. I mean, throughout the histories and despite all the differences that we may find. But my question is rather different because, I mean, apart from these diachronic similarities and differences, there are also many other things we call love. I mean, apart from sentimental love, and many ways in which love could be conceptualized. Yesterday evening, we were talking about parental and maternal love. I just mentioned Philippe Ariès. I mean, I didn't mention it, but I had it in mind. Philippe Ariès' book on children in the Middle Ages didn't love their kids. Of course, there is this religious love. I mean, and then in Spain we have plenty of literature that you know very well about this kind of feeling of elevation throughout love. Yeah. And then we also have love to some other things. I mean, both animated or inanimated, like patriotism, for example, or different kinds. Yeah. How do we relate to that? I mean, because some of the things that I think are very present in your research, in your books, is the exquisite attention you pay to words, and that was very much in Generations of Feelings. Yeah. But then here we have the same word to refer to many different realities. And how do we deal with that?
Well, I do think that it's not by chance that we use the same word when we're talking about the love that we have for our children and the love that we have for a mate and that the love that we have for the city of Madrid. I think that they all have a common theme, and that is a kind of biological theme, but it's metaphorical, a kind of elevating, a kind of sense of joy that's mingled with the feeling that we call love. Love is such a small word, you know. I mean, it's just 4 letters in Spanish, not much more in English. It's such a small word, but it's words are wonderful because they are like suitcases, you know, which they're packed with meaning and with resonance, just like in music. When you have the C major scale, yes? It's the C major scale, it's always a C major scale. No, it's not. You can play it slowly and it starts to feel something different. You can play one note and then skip a note and then the next note, and you're starting to make a new tune. And so the emotions, like love, contain within them the possibility of a musical scale, or even more than one scale, because, as all composers know, the C major scale has a minor scale to go with it. And so I think if we think about emotions in a way as packing within them a tremendous amount of meaning in a very small space, we may be better able to understand why we can use the same term for so many different things.
Let me get the last 2 questions. I mean, one of them is sort of curiosity about in your last books, you introduce yourself, which I think it is a fascinating rhetoric kind of device. I mean, I know many people, I mean, this has become a sort of a commonplace, but in the case of the history of the emotions, it seems to be the case that people who do that, I mean, I don't know you, is because in a certain way they feel emotionally involved in the subject they are dealing with. And then you actually put examples of your own childhood or in different occasions of your different experiences of life. So my question is whether this is a methodological point, which is a necessary condition. I mean, for doing history of emotions, you have to be emotionally involved and having an experience of the emotions we are dealing with. Yeah. And if that were the case, how do we deal with emotions of the past or even with emotions we cannot have an experience of? So that would be my question.
Well, as an academic, I was trained not to do such a thing, never to put myself into my work. And yet, I have never been comfortable with that. I have always felt that the only reason why a historian writes is because what he or she is writing about has relevance to her and is important to her. And so I have never not really talked about myself, although maybe it's been more hidden. But with emotions, I think it is important to say, look, this isn't just the politics of Louis XIV, and I have nothing to do with the politics of Louis XIV. I think it's important to say, look, this is something that in my own way I have experienced. You very likely have experienced it. See if this book helps you experience it a little bit differently, if it offers new horizons for your own experiences, new vocabulary for your own experiences, because in writing these books, I have learned to think about my own experiences in new ways.
Well, thank you. The last question, I mean, rather a reflection, I mean, something to think of together. Yesterday we were listening in a different venue at the Fundación Ortega. We were listening to Professor Dustin, who is, in my view, one of the leading figures in the history of rationality, and then she was certainly talking about that, and I was very pleased with that talk. Today you are talking about history of the emotions, the difference being that whereas the history of rationality is still back with males, in the history of the emotions, I mean, myself and some others being kind of exception, is mainly driven by women. I mean, if we look at the Society for the History of the Emotions, at the Latin American Society for the History of the Emotions, but why you think males have so many difficulties in getting into these subjects?
Well, I'll blame Plato. Yeah. He made the charioteer the controller of emotions, and he made the white horse and the black horse the passions, and, you know, the charioteer controls the white horse and the black horse, and they need to be controlled or they're out of control. And so I'll blame him for why that's the case. But I would like to say that I do think that men have talked about emotions. For example, Aristotle talked about emotions. They have been very important in the theories of the Scottish Enlightenment and so on. To identify the male as the rational being and the woman as the irrational being has been one of the faults that exist within this wonderful treasury. It always can be misused. And I think that that is really not true if you look at the facts, but it's an easy thing to do. And it is, to some extent, culturally encouraged.
Sure. Well, thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you to the audience.